It was the pearls that Miss Marple noticed first, and not because they were beautiful. They lay on the vestry table beside the parish register, coiled twice upon a square of white lawn, and they were quite the wrong colour for the light. Any pearl worth the wearing had a certain forgiving warmth in it, a soft borrowed quality that answered to the skin beneath. These did not. In the pale April sun that came through the vestry window they looked, to Miss Marple's eye, exactly as pearls look when they have been recently taken off a woman who is frightened. She did not know, of course, that Lady Serena Wexley had been frightened. Not yet. She only knew that the pearls did not belong on a vestry table at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, that the vicar's wife had passed the pew where they now sat 3 times without seeing them, and that a small, unremarkable person named Alice Pettit, who assisted with the flowers on alternate weeks, had come out of the vestry looking as though she had swallowed a moth. "Miss Marple," said Alice Pettit, in a voice pitched a full tone above her own, "would you be so very kind as to step in a moment? I hardly like to touch them, and I hardly like to leave them, and Mrs. Harbury is in the churchyard with the daffodils, and won't be back for a good 10 minutes. That was the beginning, then, a borrowed string of pearls, left where no honest hand would leave them, in a village that had spent the whole of Lent watching the great house on the hill. The great house was Wexley Court, and the pearls belonged to Lady Serena Wexley, who was 35 and beautiful in the modern way, that is to say thin, pale, restless, and given to a laugh that never quite arrived at its intended amusement. She had married Sir Rowland Wexley 3 winters before. Sir Rowland was not a young man. He was not a well man either, though he was a great deal better than he permitted his household to believe. The pearls had come out of a box in his mother's dressing-room on the day of the wedding, and Lady Serena wore them at every dinner at which anyone at all was expected to look at her, which in the country meant several times a week. That she should have taken them off, herself, and laid them on a vestry table in St. Mary Mead was, Miss Marple thought as she considered the double coil upon the lawn, quite as improbable as that she should have laid down her own hand. "There is a knot in the string," said Alice Pettit, still hovering. Miss Marple bent closer. It was true. Someone had tied a small clumsy knot near the clasp, of the sort a person makes when they wish to shorten a strand in a hurry and have no proper thought of repair. The clasp itself was undone, and the safety chain, she had a very clear memory of admiring it at Christmas, was broken clean through at the loop. "Oh dear," said Miss Marple. "You see," said Alice Pettit. "I do see. Alice, dear, would you go across to the churchyard and ask Mrs. Harbury to come? And on the way would you happen to notice whether the door of the north porch is standing open?" Alice went. Miss Marple remained, with her hands folded neatly at her waist, and did not touch the pearls. She looked at them for perhaps 2 minutes with the exact expression of a woman consulting a bad piece of news, and then she looked at the register, which was still open at the page for the last christening, and then she looked at the little cupboard where the cassocks hung. The cupboard was not quite closed. Between the door and the jamb there was a strip of dark blue serge, no wider than a finger, showing that a garment inside had been hastily replaced and caught. Miss Marple considered the strip of serge for a good deal longer than she had considered the pearls. She thought, not for the first time in her life, that a great many crimes had been given away, in the ordinary course, not by the thing hidden, but by the thing hidden hurriedly. A careful woman would have opened the cupboard again and freed the sleeve and closed the door properly. Somebody had not. Somebody had come away from the cupboard with the strip of cloth still caught, and had not gone back for it, either because they had not noticed, or because there had been no time. Mrs. Harbury arrived at a run, with the daffodils still in her arms and mud upon her shoes. She was a large, cheerful woman, who was frightened of very few things in this world, and jewellery upon a vestry table was not. In the ordinary way, one of them. "Oh, my good heavens," said Mrs. Harbury, "those are Serena's." "Yes, but however did they come here?" "I don't yet know, my dear. I think we had better not touch them. I think we had better send word to the court, and I think it might be wise to send word to Constable Polk." Mrs. Harbury looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the pearls. Then she looked at Miss Marple again. "You believe something has happened. I am afraid I do, yes. But nothing has happened at the court, Jane. I passed the drive 20 minutes ago and there was a boy scrubbing the step. Nobody scrubs a step at a house where anything has happened. That is quite true, Kitty. And yet I think we shall find that something has happened, and that the boy on the step does not know it. Mrs. Harbury did as she was told. Miss Marple, left alone in the vestry a second time, stood with her hand on the back of the vestry chair and did not sit down. It was one of the small telling habits of her mind that she did not sit in a room in which somebody else's misfortune had recently been laid out. She only stood and looked and considered. She looked again at the pearls. She looked at the register. She looked at the cassock cupboard and the strip of blue. She looked at the little strip of carpet in front of the vestry door and saw that a woman's shoe had scraped it, quite lightly, quite recently, in the ordinary way of somebody backing hastily against the door as it opened inward. She looked at the north porch door, which, when she stepped to it, was indeed standing an inch open, though Mrs. Harbury never left it so. She looked last at the sky through the porch, which had begun to cloud, and she said to herself that whatever had happened at Wexley Court had happened before 6 in the morning, because the dew on the outer sill of the vestry window had been disturbed exactly once, by exactly one person, whose shoe had left the print of a low, decent heel, not a boot, not a man's shoe, pointing away from the church. At Wexley Court that morning, Lady Serena Wexley was already dead. She had been found, at 9:45, by her personal maid, sitting upright in the small blue chair at her dressing-table, with her hands in her lap and her chin fallen forward, as if in unusual contemplation of her own lace. There was no violence upon her that the eye could immediately reach. There was a faint smell in the room that the maid could not name, but did not like. The window was open a hand's breadth upon the terrace, and the pearls that Lady Serena had worn to dinner the previous night were not in the velvet-lined tray where she was accustomed to lay them. Dr. Haydock, sent for on the instant, took one look at Lady Serena and asked to be left alone with her for 10 minutes. When he came out, he asked to speak to Sir Rowland. What passed between them was afterwards imperfectly reported in the village, but it was known within an hour that Dr. Haydock had said the word poison, and that Sir Rowland had said, in a voice that no one in the household had heard before, "Then somebody in this house has done it." Constable Pulk arrived from Much Benham at midday, together with Inspector Slack, whose face bore that expression of resigned displeasure with which he greeted every summons that took him into a village he privately regarded as an obstacle to justice. He was informed within 1/4 of an hour of his arrival that Lady Serena's pearls had turned up on the vestry table of St. Mary Mead. He was informed within 1/4 of an hour after that, by the vicar's wife, that Miss Jane Marple had been present when they were found. Inspector Slack said something under his breath, which the vicar's wife pretended not to hear. He came, however, to Miss Marple's cottage at 3 o'clock, which was very civil of him considering the state of his temper, and Miss Marple gave him tea and a slice of her own seed cake, and answered his questions in the order in which he asked them. Yes, she had seen the pearls on the vestry table. Yes, she had recognised them. She had admired them, in the ordinary way, at Christmas, at the servants' tea, and had noticed then that the safety chain was very finely made. No, she had not touched them. No, she had not seen anyone leave the vestry. The north porch door had, however, been standing open, which was unusual on a Tuesday morning, and there had been a small piece of dark blue serge caught in the cupboard door, which she had not felt it her place to remove. Inspector Slack said, with the air of a man making an important concession, that he supposed she had best show him. She did. He looked at the strip of serge, he looked at the pearls. He said the piece of cloth was very likely nothing at all. Some choir boy's cassock caught the last Sunday and forgotten, and he took the pearls away in an envelope. He asked Miss Marple, as he was leaving, whether she happened to know of any person in the village who might have had reason to wish Lady Serena Wexley harm. "Oh, Inspector," said Miss Marple, "I should think a very great many people. She was the sort of woman about whom people had strong feelings, you see. It is often so, with the very beautiful and the very unhappy. Inspector Slack made a note. He was not, he told himself as he walked down the lane, going to be led by the nose by a country spinster with a fondness for parables. He was going to look at the household. The household at Wexley Court that afternoon consisted for practical purposes of 5 people, and Miss Marple, sitting in her own drawing room with her knitting untouched upon her knee, made herself picture them one by one. There was Sir Rowland himself, who had loved his wife rather more than he had ever quite dared to say, and had understood her rather less than he had ever pretended. There was his cousin, Miss Dennis Wexley, who was not yet 40 and was heir presumptive to Wexley Court, in the event that Sir Rowland died without a son, which now, one supposed, was certain. There was Miss Frances Ord, who had been Lady Serena's companion, a woman of about 27, with a face that had learned very early to give away nothing at all. There was Mrs. Loam, the housekeeper, who had come to the court as an under-housemaid in Sir Rowland's mother's time, and knew the linen cupboard rather better than she knew her own scripture. And there was, finally, a young man named Julian Prust, who was staying at the court as Dennis Wexley's guest, and whom Lady Serena had, in the last month, been observed to look at rather too often and rather too long. 5 persons then in the house on the night before, and 1 dead woman in the morning. Miss Marple took up her knitting after all, and thought about Mrs. Loam. She had known Mrs. Loam for 11 years. She had watched her tighten, over that time, from a rather pretty young widow into a woman whose mouth had grown quite straight. Mrs. Loam had lost a boy at 15, a boy, Miss Marple recalled without effort, of whom his mother had once said, in a voice held very level, that he had been the only thing in the world that she had made and had not spoiled. The boy was buried in the churchyard beyond the yew, and Mrs. Loam had ever since worn a small jet cross at her throat, which had once belonged to him. If Mrs. Loam had walked from the court to the church that morning, she would have walked past that grave. Miss Marple set that thought aside, because it was not yet time. Instead she considered, quite carefully, the fact that the pearls had been on the vestry table at 10:30, and that Lady Serena had, according to Dr. Haydock, died at some time between 11 the previous night and 2 in the morning. Between 2 in the morning and 10:30 then, the pearls had left Wexley Court, travelled 3/4 of a mile down the lane, entered St. Mary Mead by the north porch, and come to rest on a square of white lawn beside the parish register. They had done this without being seen by Mrs. Harbury, who had opened the church at 8, laid out the daffodils at 9, and gone up and down the aisle a dozen times between. That meant, said Miss Marple to herself, that they had been brought in between 9 and 10:30 when Mrs. Harbury was in the churchyard. It meant that the person who brought them had known Mrs. Harbury would be in the churchyard at that hour, which was to say it was somebody who knew the parish. It meant, further, that the person had wished the pearls to be found, for one does not lay a string of pearls on a table if one wishes to conceal it. And it meant finally that the person had left in some haste, because they had caught their sleeve in the cassock cupboard on the way out. The strip of serge, of course, would tell nothing to Inspector Slack, because Inspector Slack had already made up his mind that it meant nothing. Miss Marple was very sorry about the strip of serge. She thought too about Lady Serena, really thought about her, not as one thinks about a subject of village discussion, but as one thinks about a woman one has met, and observed and pitied, and not liked. Lady Serena had been unhappy for a long time before she died. Miss Marple had watched her at the harvest festival the previous autumn, and had seen her laugh 3 times in an hour at things which were not funny, and had said to herself that here was a woman who had married the wrong life. That did not, of course, mean that she had married the wrong man. Sir Rowland was a good man. He was, in some ways, the best man she could have found. It was only that Lady Serena had wanted, in the end, to be dazzled by her own life, and Wexley Court was not the sort of house that dazzled. It merely endured. An unhappy woman, thought Miss Marple, will sometimes make herself dangerous, not because she wishes anyone harm, exactly, but because she is looking for evidence that she is still visible. She will say something at dinner in front of the servants to embarrass her husband. She will laugh at a young man over her shoulder to see how her companion takes it. She will tease a nervous woman about a letter in front of the company to see the colour rise in the woman's face. She will do these things and think herself only spirited, and not know that she is prizing the lid off something she has no wish at all to open. The following morning, being Wednesday, she called at Wexley Court. Sir Rowland received her in the small library. He was a heavy, dignified man of 63, who had never been handsome, and had always been kind, and grief sat upon him with the particular awkwardness of a garment cut for someone else. He rose when she came in. He offered her a chair. He said, before she had spoken, Miss Marple, I am very glad you have come. I am so very sorry, Sir Rowland. Yes, he did not for a moment seem able to go on. Then he said, the pearls. Yes, they found them at the church. They did.
Miss Marple, I do not understand it. I do not understand. She would not have gone to the church. She never went to the church except on Sunday, and then only because I asked it of her. She would not have taken the pearls off. She wore them to bed once, when we had guests, out of pure mischief, and she did not go out of the house last night. I looked in at 11.
She was at her dressing table. She spoke to me. She said, his voice went. He put his large hand over his face for a moment. She said, he resumed, that she was tired, and that she was sorry she had been sharp at dinner, and that we should go up to town on Friday and see about a new coat for me, because the old one made me look, she said, like a bishop who had lost his diocese. He tried to laugh. He did not manage it. Those were the last words she spoke to me, Miss Marple. That she was sorry. Miss Marple watched him gently. And you left her at her dressing table. I left her at her dressing table. Was anyone else in the house awake, do you know? Frances was still up. She had been reading to Serena. Earlier, Deniers was in the billiard room with young Prust, I heard the balls. Mrs. Loam had gone to bed at 10, as she always does. I heard her lock the still room. And in the morning, he drew in his breath. Frances found, no, it was Ellen who found her. Her maid. Ellen came at 7:30, as she always did, and thought she was asleep in the chair, and let her be, and came again at 9, and then she came for me. Where was Miss Ord at 9? Sir Rowland looked at her, and for the first time his eyes had a small, difficult sharpness in them. Frances, he said slowly, was in the morning room writing letters. She had been there since 8. I see. And Mr. Wexley, Mr. Denis Wexley? Denis had ridden out. He rides most mornings. He came in at 10 and heard the news from Loam. And Mr. Prust? Prust had not yet come down. She nodded. Sir Rowland, she said, would you object to my speaking, quite privately, to Miss Ord? He considered her. Miss Marple, he said, I should be most grateful. The inspector is a good man, I dare say, but he has settled his mind already, and I do not think he has settled it in the right place. She did not ask him where he thought Inspector Slack had settled his mind. She thought she knew. Julian Prust was 26, and had cheekbones, and had danced with Lady Serena at the Hunt Ball, in a way that had been remarked upon in 3 parishes. Before she went to Miss Ord, she asked to see the room. Sir Rowland took her himself. He would not, he said, go in with her. He went as far as the door, and put his hand upon the door, and did not open it. He said, Ellen has been in to lay out the bed. That is all. Everything else is as it was. Thank you, Sir Rowland. She went in alone. The room was very much as she had expected. It was a pretty room, in the modern taste, with light-striped paper and a small blue chair at the dressing table. The chair had been moved a little from the table, pulled out, one thought, when the maid had raised the alarm. There was a glass upon the table, with a little water still in it, and beside the glass, in the neat velvet-lined tray, an emptiness where the pearls should have been. There were 2 hairpins fallen upon the tray, as though put down carelessly by a hand in some hurry. There was upon the mirror a smudge low down near the base, of a sort that suggested a woman had leant against it briefly on her way past. Miss Marple stood in the middle of the room and considered. She noted the writing table by the window, the small enamel box in the top drawer, which stood a little ajar, the print of the Madonna above the writing table behind which, as everyone in the house knew, there was a small safe. She lifted the print 1/4 of an inch and let it fall. The safe was closed. She would not, she thought, open it now. She noted finally the door that led to the small dressing room beyond, and the door that led onto the landing, and she stood for a long moment looking at that second door. From that door, at 11:20 the night before, Francis Ord had gone out, having read Tennyson to a woman who was still alive, and to that door, at some hour in the small morning, somebody had returned, having done what they had done. There was no lock on the door on the inside. Miss Marple had noticed once that Lady Serena did not care for locks in a bedroom. She had said so, laughing, at Christmas, that she was, whatever her sins, not the sort of woman who locked doors at night. It had seemed at the time a piece of characteristic bravado. It seemed now a piece of very great pathos. Miss Marple came out. Miss Ord received Miss Marple in the morning room, into which the sun was coming very levelly across the lawn. She was a slight, neat woman with brown hair pulled back too severely for her face, and her hands, which she folded upon her lap and did not move, were extraordinarily still. Miss Marple, who noticed hands, noticed hers. "You wished to see me, Miss Marple. If it is not too painful, my dear." "Nothing," said Francis Ord, in a voice of perfect quiet, "is too painful now." Miss Marple sat. "You had been with Lady Serena for some time, I think. 4 years. You were fond of her." Miss Ord did not immediately answer. Then she said, "I loved her." "Yes, would you tell me, my dear, about the evening? From dinner onwards, everything you saw, everything you thought." Miss Ord looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Very well." Dinner, said Miss Ord, had been unpleasant. Lady Serena had been in one of the moods that had grown more frequent since Christmas, sharp, glittering, over-quick. She had spoken twice, quite deliberately, to embarrass Sir Rowland. She had laughed at Mrs. Loam for bringing in a wrong sauce, and Mrs. Loam had gone out of the room with her face closed. She had complimented Mr. Prust in front of Mr. Dennis Wexley in a way that had made Mr. Prust look at his plate. Dennis Wexley had said, "At one point, Serena, that is enough," and she had said, "Oh, my dear Dennis, I do wish you would remember I am not your cousin's daughter." After dinner she had gone into the drawing-room and played the piano for a while, badly on purpose, said Miss Ord, and then had complained of a headache, and had gone upstairs at 10:30. Miss Ord had followed. Lady Serena had asked her to read aloud. She had read Tennyson for perhaps 20 minutes. Lady Serena had been quiet, not asleep, but tired. Sir Rowland had come in, briefly, at 11. He had spoken to her. She had spoken to him. He had gone. Miss Ord had put out the lamp, no, the reading lamp, not the small one on the dressing-table, and had wished her ladyship good night, and had gone. At what hour, said Miss Marple gently, had she gone? 11:20. And you went straight to your own room? Miss Ord hesitated. It was, Miss Marple observed, the first hesitation. I went to the still room to fetch a glass of water. Then I went to my room. You saw no one? I saw Mrs. Loam on the landing, in her dressing-gown. She said she had heard something and had come to look. I said I had heard nothing. She went back to bed. And you? I went to bed. You slept? Yes, Miss Ord, said Miss Marple. When you found the still-room door, was it locked or not? Miss Ord looked at her. Locked, she said. You are quite certain? Yes, and you unlocked it. There is a key that hangs in the passage. I see. Miss Marple sat quite still for a small time, and then, quite in her ordinary voice, she said, Miss Ord, forgive me. Did Lady Serena keep her pearls in the case on the dressing table, or in the little safe behind the print of the Madonna? Miss Aude's hands, which had been still all this while, tightened upon each other for the space of a breath, and then were still again. In the case, not in the safe. No, she did not use the safe. But she kept the case locked? Yes, and where did she keep the key? In the drawer of her writing table, in a small enamel box, which is, not locked. No, thank you, my dear. Frances Aude looked at her. You are asking me, she said, whether anyone in the house could have taken the pearls. I am asking you, said Miss Marple, who did. Miss Aude did not immediately answer. When she did, her voice was so quiet that Miss Marple had to lean forward. I do not know. Miss Marple went home, that afternoon, along the lane that ran between the hedge of the court's south wall and the churchyard, and she walked very slowly, and she thought. She thought first about the still room being locked. Mrs. Loam had locked it at 10. Frances Aude had unlocked it at 11:20 from a key in the passage. The still room had a door that opened directly onto the kitchen garden, and from the kitchen garden there was a gate, and from the gate a path, and from the path one could reach the lane in 7 minutes. Between 11:20 and 10:30 the following morning was rather a long time in which for a person to have used that door. She thought, second, about Julian Prust. It was Julian Prust upon whom Inspector Slack had his eye. This she knew from Constable Palk, who had spoken very freely to Mrs. Bantry, who had spoken quite as freely to Miss Marple. Julian Prust, said Inspector Slack, had had the manner of a young man in a great state of feeling all through dinner, had left the billiard-room at some point between 11 and midnight, and gone out onto the terrace, and had been seen by Mrs. Loam on her way back from the landing, with his hand on the door of Lady Serena's dressing-room. He had said, when this was put to him, that he had been about to knock and had thought better of it. That, said Inspector Slack, was not the story of an innocent man. Miss Marple was not so sure. She thought, third, about the pearls. She stopped in the lane and looked at the churchyard through the hedge and considered the pearls again. The knot in the string, the broken safety chain, they had not been snatched from Lady Serena's throat, for she had not been wearing them. They had been taken from the case on the dressing table, where they lay very cleanly with the clasp done up. A knot could only have been tied in the string afterwards, by someone in some agitation, walking. The safety chain, further, had been broken not in the taking, but at some point later, on some object, a door frame, a hedge, a gate post. A person who had stolen a string of pearls for their value would not, said Miss Marple to herself, break the chain by rough handling and then lay them upon a vestry table for anyone to find. A person who had stolen them at all would sell them or hide them. The pearls, then, had not been stolen for their value. The pearls had been put upon the vestry table because the person wished them found. And the person had wished them found because she thought of poor Emma Barrow, who had been in service at the rectory when Miss Marple was a young woman. Emma Barrow, who had taken a small silver salt cellar from the pantry and left it on the pew where Mrs. Ashley Barrow's cousin was accustomed to sit. Little Emma, who had loved her mistress and been ill-used by her mistress's cousin, and who had been quite certain that the cousin would be blamed and turned out, and had been quite as certain, when it did not fall out so, that she must be a wicked girl for having tried it. Emma Barrow had not been a thief. Emma Barrow had been a person who had wanted somebody else to look guilty. Miss Marple stood in the lane for perhaps 30 seconds together, with her lips parted and her eyes upon the yew, and then she went on. The pearls, she now thought, had been laid upon the vestry table by somebody who wished it to appear that somebody else had put them there. The question then was who. She met at the turn of the lane Dennis Wexley. He was on foot, coming from the direction of the village. He raised his hat to her. He said, Miss Marple, "May I walk with you?" "By all means, Miss Wexley." They walked, for a moment, in silence. Miss Wexley was a lean, sallow man of about her own height, who had spent most of his life waiting for a house he had never expected really to have. He said, at last, "You have been up to see Roland." "I have. It is a very dreadful business." Yes, he was silent again. Then he said, "Miss Marple, may I speak to you frankly? I should be very glad if you would."
Slack has arrested nobody yet, but he means to arrest Julian Prust. So I understand. Julian did not do it. You are quite certain? I am quite certain. Julian is my friend. He is also, if you will forgive me, a fool. He had fallen in love with Serena. Serena had encouraged him. She encouraged everybody who came into the house. She could not help it.
But Julian is not a man who murders a woman he is in love with, Miss Marple. He is a man who writes her a bad poem and burns it in the fireplace and drinks too much whiskey and rides out at 7 in the morning to punish himself for being ridiculous. That is what he did on Tuesday morning. He walked to the village because he could not bear to be in the house. He came back because he did not know where else to go. I am inclined to agree with you, Misty Wexley. He looked at her, surprised. Are you? Yes, it has been Mr. Prust's misfortune to be visible at the wrong hour. That is all. But if it were not Mr. Prust, Misty Wexley, who was it? He looked ahead down the lane. I do not know. You must, I suppose, have thought about it. I have thought about it, Miss Marple, so continuously since Tuesday morning that I have made myself, I think, incapable of thinking about it any more. I have considered everyone in the house, myself included, and I have not come to a conclusion. Only? Yes? Only Frances, said Denise Wexley slowly, has been very quiet. Even for Frances. And I have known her for 4 years. They walked another 20 paces. Then he said, "That is a wicked thing to have said, and I did not mean to say it. Forgive me, Miss Marple." "Please do not apologise, Miss Wexley. It is very often the wicked that a person did not mean to say that are the most useful." He looked at her. His mouth twitched, once, as though he had almost smiled. Then he raised his hat again and turned in at the drive. Miss Marple walked on alone. By Thursday afternoon, Inspector Slack had made his mind up. He arrested Mr. Julian Prust in the library at Wexley Court on suspicion of the murder of Lady Serena Wexley. Mr. Prust had, said Inspector Slack, been observed at Lady Serena's dressing-room door on the night in question. He had, when questioned, been unable to give a satisfactory account of the 20 minutes that followed. He had been present, and was known to have carried on with the lady, and had, this was the point Inspector Slack privately relished, been seen at 8 o'clock the previous morning, by the boot boy, walking down the drive in the direction of the village, and had returned to the court at 20 minutes to 11, which was very nearly the time at which the pearls had appeared on the vestry table. Julian Prust said nothing. He looked, according to Mrs. Bantry, who had it from Mrs. Loam, who had been standing in the passage, quite ill. The village had its verdict inside 2 hours. Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room with Mrs. Bantry, and heard the verdict and considered it with great seriousness. Julian Prust had walked to the village between 8 and 11 on Tuesday morning. He had been present in the house on the night of the death. He had been at Lady Serena's door. He had had, if one wished to think ill of him, a motive of the ugliest domestic kind. The pearls could indeed have been carried down to the church by him, or so it seemed. She said at last to Mrs. Bantry, "Dolly, my dear, when Mr. Prust walked to the village that morning, do you happen to know what he was wearing?" Mrs. Bantry stared. "Wearing, Jane? Yes, dear, do you know?" "Well, a suit, I suppose. Grey. He is always in grey. He hasn't the colouring for anything else. Not a serge coat, or anything of a deep blue? Julian Prust in blue? Certainly not. He has too much sense." "I see. Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, watching her, "you do not think it was Julian?" "I do not, Dolly. Then who do you think it was?" Miss Marple did not answer for a moment. Then she said, "I think it was somebody who wished it to be believed that it was somebody else." Which is very difficult, you see, because it means there are two persons to be considered. The person one is supposed to think it was, and the person one is not supposed to think about at all. That sounds like one of your parables, Jane. It very often is one of my parables, Dolly. That is the trouble with parables. One does not always know which one applies until it is rather too late. Mrs. Bantry looked at her narrowly. "You have somebody in mind." "I have somebody in mind, dear, but I may be wrong. I have been wrong before, and I dare say I shall be wrong again. And I should very much dislike to say a name aloud, and be wrong about that particular name." "Which particular name?" "Never mind, dear Mrs." Bantry gave it up. She was accustomed to Miss Marple's giving up points, and had learned not to press. She went home at 6, and Miss Marple alone put her knitting away, and did not take up a book, and sat with her hands folded in the growing dusk. She was thinking about Mrs. Loam. Miss Marple went upstairs that evening after Mrs. Bantry had gone home, and stood at the window of her bedroom for a very long time, and watched the lights of Wexley Court through the trees, and thought about a piece of dark blue serge in the vestry cupboard, and she said, aloud, "To no one at all, I have been wrong." Julian Prust had been at Lady Serena's door because he had been about to knock. He had walked to the village on the Tuesday morning because he had wished, quite plainly, to be gone from the house before he was asked to look at her body. He had said nothing to Inspector Slack because he was 26 and heart-struck, and had not the smallest idea how to defend a case which he did not know how to name. Julian Prust had not killed Lady Serena. Julian Prust had not taken her pearls. The pearls had been carried to the church by somebody wearing a deep blue serge coat. Julian Prust owned no such coat. Mr. Dennis Wexley wore habitually a coat of that colour, but Mr. Dennis Wexley had ridden out at 8 and returned at 10, and had not been seen in the direction of the church. Sir Rowland did not own such a coat. Miss Ord did not own such a coat. But Mrs. Loam did. Misters Loam wore over her housekeeping black in the mornings when she went out to the herb beds, a dark blue serge working coat that had belonged once to her son. Miss Marple had seen it on her 100 times. She had seen it at the Christmas servants' tea folded upon a chair. She had seen it on the previous September on Mrs. Loam's shoulders in the churchyard, when Mrs. Loam had come out from the court to lay a small posy on the grave under the yew. Mrs. Loam had killed Lady Serena. Mrs. Loam had taken the pearls. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window, and she was, for a moment, entirely certain of it. She thought of Mrs. Loam on the landing at 11:20. She thought of Mrs. Loam, who had the key to every cupboard in the house and every case within them. She thought of Mrs. Loam, who had gone out of the dining room with a closed face when Lady Serena laughed at her sauce. She thought of the boy under the yew, and of a mother who had learned to keep her mouth quite straight, and she thought for the space of the whole of one evening, and the whole of one night, and the greater part of one morning, that Mrs. Loam had done it. By Friday at 11, when she walked down to the post office to send a letter, she was persuaded of it. She had constructed the case in her mind with a completeness that did not admit of doubt. Mrs. Loam had risen, at some hour in the small morning, and had let herself into her mistress's dressing room with the housekeeper's key, had administered. For there was a still room full of such possibilities. The dose that killed her had taken the pearls from the case, because Lady Serena had once laughed at her, had walked, in her dark blue serge coat, at 9 down to the church while Mrs. Harbury was in the churchyard, had laid the pearls upon the vestry table so that when they were found the household should be searched, and so that Julian Prust, whose fault, in Mrs. Loam's mind, this whole disgrace had ultimately been, should be understood to have taken them, and had come back to the court and put her coat away in a hurry and caught the sleeve in the cupboard door. It fitted. It fitted, said Miss Marple to herself in the post office, extraordinarily well. It fitted, she thought as she walked home, in the way that theories of one's own construction always fit, a little too neatly at the joints, and with a very small, uneasy space at the centre where a thing had been made to conform. but she did not, that morning, examine the uneasy space. She wished that morning to have solved it. She had been in the business of watching human beings for a great many years, and she was not above the ordinary human wish to have finished a piece of work. She had, that Friday morning, a small conversation with Mrs. Loam. She had gone up to the court on the pretext of returning a book of Sir Rowland's. She had said, in the still room, "Loam, my dear, I hope you have been sleeping. It is a dreadful thing." Mrs. Loam, who was polishing a copper pan with the exactness of a woman who does not wish to be spoken to, had said, "I have not. Miss Marple, no, you cared for her." Mrs. Loam had put the pan down. "I did not care for her, Miss Marple," she said, quite evenly, "and I shall not pretend I did. But I did not wish her dead. I have known 5 mistresses at the court. She was the worst of them. But no, I did not wish her dead." Miss Marple had looked at her then very steadily. "Loam," she said, "on Tuesday morning when you went out to the herb beds, were you wearing your dark blue coat?" Mrs. Loam had looked back at her. She had not blinked. "I was not, Miss Marple," she said. "I have not worn that coat since last September. I put it away when the weather turned. It is in the cedar press on the landing. You are quite certain." "I am quite certain, Miss Marple. I do not wear that coat now. It reminds me too much." She had said it without heat, without embellishment, without any of the small ornaments of a lie. Miss Marple had gone home. She had sat in her drawing-room. She had made herself a cup of tea, and had not drunk it, and had thought that was the moment. A small, silent, quite terrible moment in her sitting-room, with the tea cooling and the clock making its ordinary noise, at which she understood that she had been wrong. Mrs. Loam was not lying. Miss Marple had known Mrs. Loam for 11 years, and Mrs. Loam did not lie in that voice. She had every reason of the world to lie, and she was not lying. The coat was in the cedar press. Mrs. Loam had not worn it since September, and that meant that somebody else had. Somebody else had gone to the cedar press on the landing, at some hour on Monday night or Tuesday morning, had taken Mrs. Loam's dark blue serge coat, which was the one dark garment in the house that would not draw the eye at 9 in the morning in the lane, had worn it down to the church, had caught the sleeve on the cassock cupboard door, and had returned it and put it back into the cedar press, so that any question of a blue coat should point straight at Mrs. Loam, who was the housekeeper, who had the keys, who had gone out of the dining room with her mouth closed, who was known to have been on the landing at 11:20, and who, this was the thing, had a son beneath the yew tree in the churchyard, past which she walked whenever she went to the village, and whose grave the killer had counted on her visiting. Mrs. Loam was intended to hang. Miss Marple sat, quite still in her chair. Her tea grew cold. The clock struck the quarter. She saw, quite clearly, that Julian Prust had been intended to be blamed for the death, and Mrs. Loam had been intended to be blamed for the theft, and that the 2 frames had been laid, one on top of the other, by the same hand. It was a very cold thing to have done, not a heat of the moment, not a snatch at a chance. It was patient. It was a plan made by somebody who had known both people well, who had known Julian Prust would be at that door, and who had known Mrs. Loam would have gone out of the dining room with her face closed. Somebody who had watched a woman for 4 years, and had watched a housekeeper for 4 years, and had watched a young man for a fortnight, and had put them all in their places on the board before playing. Miss Marple sat with her cold tea, and understood with a small heavy pain that she had felt only a few times in her life, that she had known who it was for 2 days without permitting herself to know it. She thought, because it was her habit, and because in the end her habit was the truest thing she owned, of another village, and another life. She thought of Miss Louisa Prewett, who had kept house for her invalid brother in the vicarage at Little Kentford in the year that Miss Marple herself had been 22. Louisa Prewett, 43, plain, silent, devoted, who had watched her brother make his will in favour of a very pretty young cousin who visited them in the summers, and who had, one warm evening, drowned the cousin in the mill pond and arranged the appearance of an accident with such exact and patient art that the coroner had spoken of the tragedy of high spirits and slippery weeds. Louisa Pruett, who was not discovered in the end by anything at all clever, who was discovered only because, 3 months afterwards, when the brother said in her presence that it was a mercy no one else had been at the pond that afternoon, Louisa Pruett had said no, indeed, in a voice of perfect quiet. Miss Marple had been in the room. She had never forgotten it. The voice had been the voice of a woman who had not been at the pond, and knew she had not been at the pond, and had answered as though this were a matter of small polite fact. It had been the voice of somebody who did not permit herself the ordinary tremor of a human being who has recently done a dreadful thing. It had been, in short, the voice of somebody whose hands were still. Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room. She thought of a pair of hands folded upon a lap. She thought of a voice saying, 4 years, and I loved her, and no, nothing is too painful now, in the same still register with which one might say, 11:20. She thought of Frances Ord. Frances Ord had said she had unlocked the still room at 11:20 with the key from the passage. Frances Ord had said the still room had been locked. But Mrs. Loam had locked the still room at 10. If Miss Ord had gone at 11:20 and had unlocked it, and had then returned the key to the passage, that was all consistent. But Miss Marple recalled, now, quite exactly, that Sir Rowland had said Mrs. Loam had locked the still room at 10. Sir Rowland had heard her. He had said, I heard Mrs. Loam lock the still room. He had heard her because Mrs. Loam locked the still room from the inside, and left by the kitchen garden door, which was habit, and one only heard the still room being locked if the person locking it was inside it, going out. Which meant that the still room, when Miss Ord approached it at 11:20, could not have been locked from the passage. It was locked, but the key was inside the still room, in the door, where Mrs. Loam had left it on her way out. Miss Ord had said she had fetched the key from the passage. Miss Ord had said the passage key. The passage key hung on a hook by the linen cupboard. Miss Marple had seen it hang there for 11 years. It was, and had always been, a spare, used when the inner key was lost, or in the rare event that the still room was locked from the outside. It was almost never used. To go to the passage key at 11:20 at night, Miss Ord would have had to know, with a housekeeper's knowledge, that the still room key was on the inside of the door. And she had not gone to the still room for a glass of water. There was a jug of water on the landing table outside her own room. Miss Marple herself, as a guest at the court for the Christmas tea, had drunk from it. Miss Ord had gone to the still room, on the night that her mistress died, for something else. She had gone because the still room contained the tinctures and the small green bottle of the veterinary drops that Mrs. Loam kept for the terriers, and 1 or 2 other things, less kindly, in a locked cupboard within the still room, whose key Mrs. Loam kept in the drawer of the dresser. Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room on Friday afternoon at 3:30, and understood that Frances Ord had murdered Lady Serena Wexley. She understood, next, why, for that she required only the small enamel box in the drawer of Lady Serena's writing-table, in which the key to the pearl case was kept, and which was not locked, and which had been open and disturbed on the morning that the body was found. Sir Rowland had said so, in passing, and she had not then remarked it. Frances Ord had had that key in her hand 100 times. She had also, for she was Lady Serena's companion, had every letter Lady Serena wrote passed under her eye, and every letter Lady Serena received. Miss Marple thought about that. She thought further of a small circumstance which had been in the village for perhaps a month. 6 weeks earlier, Miss Ord had gone up to London for 2 days on Lady Serena's business, and had not returned by the second evening, and had returned in fact only on the third morning, with an appearance of some pallor. It was not the sort of thing anyone had remarked upon, except Mrs. Bantry, who had remarked to Miss Marple that Frances Ord had come back looking as though she had been drowning. Miss Marple at the time had considered the matter of no interest. She considered it now of a great deal of interest. She rose and put on her hat and her gloves and walked down to Wexley Court. She walked slowly because she wished to be quite sure of what she was going to do. And she was, and she did it. She asked to see Sir Rowland. She asked him, quite quietly, whether Miss Aude had, in the last 3 months, received any letter or communication which had appeared to distress her, whether Miss Aude had, in the same time, spoken of leaving her post, whether Lady Serena, in the same time, had said anything at all in Miss Aude's presence about a person, or a matter, in London. Sir Rowland was a man in grief. He was also a man who had been the master of a large house for 30 years, and had noticed a great deal more than his wife had ever supposed. He thought, for a moment, with his heavy hand upon the arm of his chair. He said, "There was a letter at the end of February. It came for Frances. She was silent for a whole day after it. She did not speak of it. Serena, who noticed such things, teased her about it." "Teased her, Sir Rowland?" "Serena," said Sir Rowland, very slowly, "said in front of the drawing-room company one evening that our Frances had a follower she was ashamed of. And Miss Aude?" Frances went white, and then she smiled, and then she said, "Not a follower, Lady Serena, a brother." "A brother," that is what she said. "And Lady Serena?" Serena laughed. She said, "A brother." "Well, my dear, we shall have to find out about your brother, shan't we?" And then she went in to dinner. "Sir Rowland," said Miss Marple, "what was Miss Aude's brother?" Sir Rowland looked at her. "She has no brother, Miss Marple. She has told me so herself more than once. She is quite alone in the world." Miss Marple sat in the small library at Wexley Court and closed her eyes for the space of 2 breaths. "Sir Rowland," she said, "will you be so very good as to send for Inspector Slack? And, at the same time, would you ask Miss Aude to come here to speak with me? And Mrs. Loam? And, if it is not too painful, would you yourself remain?" Sir Rowland looked at her. He said, "Yes, Miss Marple." She sat then in the small library, alone, for perhaps 20 minutes, and did not move. She heard, in the passage, the movement of a maid going down. She heard the clock in the hall strike the quarter. She heard at the far end of the house a door open and close. She thought once of getting up to warm her hands, for she had grown cold, and then she did not. She sat with her hands folded and waited. She was thinking in that 20 minutes of Frances Aude as she had first seen her, 4 years before. A neat, silent, correct young woman, quite plain, with brown hair pulled back too severely. She had come out into the drive at the court to hand Lady Serena a shawl, and had stood a step behind her mistress and had not spoken. Miss Marple had said to Mrs. Bantry, going home, that Lady Serena had been fortunate in her companion. Mrs. Bantry had said, "Yes, she is a very self-possessed young woman." Miss Marple had corrected her. "Gently, she is a very self-controlled young woman, Dolly. It is not always the same thing." She thought next of Frances Aude as she had been at the Harvest Festival, standing at Lady Serena's shoulder and looking not at Lady Serena but at a point beyond her, as though she were doing what she must, and thinking of something else. Miss Marple had wondered then what she was thinking of. She had, in the ordinary course, forgotten to wonder. She thought now that Frances Aude had been thinking, at the Harvest Festival, of a small locked room in the asylum in London, and of a brother whose hands were not still. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour. He was not in a good humour. He had the arrest of Julian Prust in his pocket, and he did not much wish to be summoned by a country spinster to a family sitting-room to be lectured on the finer feelings of the case. Miss Marple was already there. So was Sir Rowland, who sat in his own chair with his hands folded. So was Mrs. Loam, standing, quite straight, by the door. So was Frances Aude, seated on the small sofa with her hands folded upon her lap, and her hands, Miss Marple observed, were extraordinarily still. Miss Marple did not begin with Miss Ord. She began with the pearls. She said quite mildly that she had been considering the pearls, and that she thought it was time to say what she thought of them. Inspector Slack, who had settled himself in the largest chair, said with a fair semblance of civility that Miss Marple was very welcome to say what she thought of them so long as she did not delay the operations of the law. "Oh, I shall not delay them, Inspector, only I think perhaps I may direct them." She said then that whoever had laid the pearls upon the vestry table had done so in order that Mrs. Loam should be blamed for their theft, and that whoever had done that had worn Mrs. Loam's own dark blue serge coat down to the church, and had returned it, torn at the sleeve, to the cedar press on the landing. Mrs. Loam by the door did not move. Her mouth had tightened. Miss Marple said then that whoever had laid the pearls upon the vestry table had also arranged that Mr. Julian Prust should be believed to have carried them there, for Mr. Prust had in fact walked to the village at that hour, from motives entirely his own, and had been the visible person in the lane. She said that Mr. Prust was innocent. Inspector Slack sat forward. "Miss Marple, one moment, Inspector." She said then that the person who had done these things had, on the night before, gone down to the still room after Mrs. Loam had locked it from within, had used the passage spare whose existence she had known of because she was of the house, had taken from a cupboard therein a certain small green bottle, had returned, had entered Lady Serena's dressing-room, into which she had already, that evening, been admitted for the reading of Tennyson, had administered the drops in the water at Lady Serena's elbow, had taken the pearls from the case, of which the key lay in an enamel box in the drawer of the writing-table which she had opened 100 times before, had gone to her own room, and had in the morning put on Mrs. Loam's coat and walked down to the church. Frances Ord did not move. Her hands were folded upon her lap. Her face was quite still. "Miss Marple," said Inspector Slack, "in a voice of some difficulty, you are making—" "I am making an accusation." "Inspector." "Yes." She turned to Miss Ord. "Miss Ord," she said gently, "would you tell us about your brother?" Frances Ord looked at her. She did not for a moment answer. Then she said, "I have no brother." "Not now, my dear." Miss Ord said nothing. "There was a letter at the end of February," said Miss Marple. "There was a journey to London. There was a return on the third day in some distress. And there was Lady Serena who noticed things, who noticed too many things, teasing you about a follower in front of the company, and calling him a brother because you had said he was one, and saying, in front of Sir Rowland, and Mr. Dennis Wexley, and Mr. Prust, that she should have to find out about your brother. She meant to find out, I think. She had already begun to. Lady Serena had a great many faults, Miss Ord, but idleness was not one of them. She had written to somebody in London. Perhaps she had written to more than one. I think, my dear, that in another week she would have known what your brother was. Miss Ord's hands, upon her lap, did not tremble. They did not move at all. And Miss Marple, watching them, saw the exact stillness that had been Louisa Pruett's 50 years before at the vicarage at Little Kentford. She said, in the same soft voice, "It is a very dreadful thing, my dear, to have loved someone and to have watched them wait. And wait, and be very ill-served, and then to be told by a woman who has never wanted anything she has, that this person, whose name you have not spoken in 7 years, is to be found out and displayed and disgraced. It is a dreadful thing, and it makes the hands very still." Frances Ord looked at her. "I loved her," she said. "Yes, my dear, I loved her. I served her, I read to her, I put out her clothes, I answered her letters. She stopped. She said, in a voice quite altered, she said that evening at dinner, she said in front of Julian Prust that she should have to find out about my brother. And she looked at me, Miss Marple. She looked at me, and she smiled. And I understood then that she had already written the letter. To whom, my dear? To the doctor at the asylum. There was, in the small library, a silence. "My brother," said Frances Ord, and her voice was now quite level, and her hands were still upon her lap, has been in an asylum for public criminals since 1917. He did a thing when he was 17 which he was not, able to help. I have paid, out of my wages, for 11 years to keep him in a place where he is fed and warm and quiet.
I have never told anyone. I told Lady Serena that I had no family because I had no other family. And she was going to write to the superintendent and ask questions, and she was going to have it out at the servants' tea in front of Mrs. Loam and Ellen and the boot boy in the pleasant voice she used for those things, and her voice went. I would rather, she said, have died than let her.
But you did not die, my dear. No, I did not die. She did. She lifted her eyes then. There was, in her face, no shame at all, only a great and quite terrible fatigue, and something else, which was very like relief. She said, I meant them to say it was Mrs. Loam, she had gone out of the dining room. She had looked at Serena in a certain way. She had a son in the churchyard, and she had reason to hate her, and the coat was there. I am sorry, Loam. Mrs. Loam by the door did not answer. Her mouth was quite straight. And Julian? Said Miss Marple. Julian was in the lane. It was convenience. I am sorry for that too. She was silent then for a long moment. Then quite suddenly her hands moved. They came up to her mouth and pressed against it, and her whole body bent forward as though she had been struck at the waist, and she made a sound that was not at first weeping, a small dry sound over and over, of a person who has been holding herself upright for a very long time and can no longer manage it. Sir Rowland rose from his chair and stood, uncertain, and did not go to her. Mrs. Loam by the door put her hand for a moment across her own throat, where the small jet cross was. Inspector Slack, whose face had passed through a considerable variety of expression in the last 5 minutes, sat entirely still. Miss Marple did not move. She said, quite gently, you should tell the inspector, Miss Ord, about the bottle in the cupboard, and the coat, and where you have put the still room key. It will be easier now. Frances Ord, after a moment, told him. She told him, quite exactly, and in a voice that had grown, by degrees, small and even and almost polite. She told him where the small green bottle was, and how she had washed and returned the glass, and where the coat hung in the cedar press with the sleeve torn, and how she had put the passage key back upon its hook. She told him the hour at which she had entered her mistress's room, and the hour at which she had left it. She told him at last that Lady Serena had been asleep when she had done it, and that Lady Serena had not woken. She did not know, she said. She did not know it was I. She looked up at Sir Rowland then. I am sorry, Sir Rowland. Sir Rowland said, yes, Frances. He did not say anything else. His hand upon the arm of his chair tightened once, and then was still. Inspector Slack, who had recovered himself, rose. He spoke to Miss Ord in a voice that was, for him, remarkably quiet. He asked her to come with him. He offered her his arm, which she declined, quite politely, and she went out of the room with him, walking, Miss Marple observed, in exactly the way she had come in, with her back straight and her hands loose at her sides, as though nothing at all had changed. Nothing at all, Miss Marple thought, had. She had been holding herself upright, Frances Ord, for a very long time. The door closed. Mrs. Loam, by the door, drew a long breath. She said, in a voice that had thickened, I would like to sit down, Sir Rowland, if I may. Sit down, Loam. She sat. She sat as though the strength had gone from her legs at last. She put her hands over her face, briefly, and then took them away, and looked at Miss Marple and said, You knew it was not I. I thought it was you, Loam, for the better part of a day. I ask your pardon. You are a very honest woman, Miss Marple. I am a very slow one, my dear. They sat for a moment. Then Sir Rowland said, without lifting his head, she did not know it was Frances. Serena, she did not know. No, Sir Rowland. That is, his voice broke once. That is something. Yes, Sir Rowland, that is something. He said, after a further silence, and in a voice that Miss Marple would afterwards remember, "I ought to have known about the brother." Frances told me, in her way, 20 times. She told me every time she went up to London on Serena's business. She told me every time she asked for her wages a fortnight early. She told me every time she stood behind Serena and did not smile. And I did not want to have known. You could not have known, Sir Rowland. I could have asked, Miss Marple. Miss Marple did not answer. There was no answer, she thought. That would be an honest one. He could have asked. He had not. And it was a piece of the ordinary carelessness with which one household treats another under its own roof. And it was not a thing on which one lectured a man whose wife had died on Tuesday. Mrs. Loam, sitting, said presently, "The coat. I should like to burn the coat." "Burn it, Loam." "Yes, Sir Rowland." She rose then, quite composedly, and went out of the room. Miss Marple heard her step upon the stair, and then, after a while, upon the landing above. She rose herself. She went quietly to the window of the small library, and stood there for a moment, and looked out across the terrace to the lawn where the light was going. At the end of the lawn was the gate that led into the lane, and beyond the lane the churchyard, and beyond the churchyard the tower of St. Mary Mead. In the tower, at that hour, Mr. Harbury was ringing the evening bell for the Angelus, as he did every evening at 6, and had done for 31 years. The sound came very clearly across the grass. It came, this evening, without hurry and without hesitation, and without the small, clumsy repetition that had, Miss Marple realised, for she had, without knowing it, listened for it every evening for a week, marked the ringing since the previous Tuesday. Mr. Harbury on that Tuesday had been called to the church early on account of the pearls, and had missed his rope work, and had rung the evening bell twice at the second stroke, and had done so in his distress every evening since. He had this evening rung it as he had used to. The village had gone back into its ordinary shape. Miss Marple stood at the window and listened to the bell. Mrs. Loam, in her chair by the door, she'd come back, Miss Marple heard, and sat again, listened also, and lifted her head at the sound, and did not, this time, put her hand to the small jet cross at her throat. Her hand stayed in her lap. Sir Rowland, in his own chair, closed his eyes. The bell rang out, quite steadily, 6 times across the lawn and the lane and the churchyard, and the last stroke fell as it should, and the sound of it held for a moment in the air and then went. Mr. Harbury in the tower said, in the ordinary voice of a man completing an ordinary task, "There," which Miss Marple could not hear, but knew that he had said because she had known him for 40 years. She turned from the window. "I shall walk home, Sir Rowland, if I may." "Loam will drive you, Miss Marple." "No, thank you. I should like the walk." She went out into the hall and put on her hat, and went out through the front door and down the drive. It was not yet dark. The lane, when she came to it, smelled of hedge and of the first of the May. The gate of the churchyard stood open, as it always did in the evening. She walked past it. She did not go in. She went instead straight on, down the lane towards her own cottage, with her hands folded before her and her step, as always, quite unhurried. Behind her, in the tower, the bell was silent, its work done for the day. Ahead of her, on the little table by her own front door, was the letter she had begun that morning to her nephew Raymond, which she would finish tonight, and in which she would say nothing at all of Lady Serena Wexley, or of Mrs. Loam, or of Miss Frances Ord, or of a small green bottle, or of a piece of dark blue serge caught in a cupboard door. She would say, instead, that the May was early this year, and that Mr. Harbury had rung the bell very beautifully that evening, and that she hoped he was eating properly. She walked on down the lane, in the last of the light, and the bell did not ring again, and the village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet behind her, under a sky the exact colour of borrowed pearls.